Chapter 7. Chronic Shock. The 5-year-old boy sat in his room at his desk. He was staring into a coloring book, and his crayons were laid neatly beside him, ready to fill the blank spaces between the lines with bright colors. His hands made no move to the colored crayons, and his eyes did not really see the pages of the coloring book. Instead, he was listening to his mother and father fight again. The words of the fight were not clear, but he could hear the rise and fall of his parents' voices over the background noise of the TV. He was always afraid when his parents fought, and he always tried to make himself scarce whenever a fight broke out between them. This particular argument did not seem any different from any of the other arguments that his mom and dad had had in the past. Their fights always frightened him, and somehow he always felt that he was to blame. Suddenly, the tempo of the fight downstairs picked up, and he heard his father shout, "It's my house, and I'll do what the hell I want." He heard his mother scream something that sounded like, "No." Then there was a loud crack of a gun being fired. The house became absolutely quiet. The boy held his breath and listened for a sound, any sound. Fear seemed to grow and swell up inside of him. He wanted desperately to find out what had happened downstairs, but he was frozen in his chair. He just sat and stared blankly at his coloring book. After what seemed forever, he heard his mother sobbing. His first thought was, "She's alive. He didn't kill her." After a time, the boy began breathing again. He slid off his chair, went out of his room, and down the stairs. His heart was pounding as he came to the living room door. As he looked into the living room, he could see his father sitting in the chair in front of the TV. There was a drink in his father's hand, and a pistol lay smoking in his lap. The TV was silent, and the screen was shattered where a bullet had smashed into it. His mother was sitting on the couch crying. She looked up, saw him in the doorway, and said in an even voice, "Your father shot out the TV. Go to bed." The little boy went back to his room and got undressed and climbed into bed. The house was quiet. Inside of the boy, the overwhelming fear had turned into numbness. If the child were asked what he felt at this time, he would have said, "Nothing." He would not have been lying. He truly felt nothing. In later years, he would look back at this incident and not feel any emotions. His memory would function as if he were watching a TV show, as if he were an observer of the event and not the participant. In the above case history, the child went into shock. The shock state was based upon the view of the child that one parent had killed another. For a child, the loss, or imagined loss, of one or both parents is a catastrophic event. The child is overwhelmed by fear. Children depend on their parents for their security, and in the above situation, the child had been faced with the death of a parent. During the shock state, certain events happen to both the emotional and the physical aspects of the person experiencing the shock. On the physical level, the body gears itself up to manage the disaster. Some of the things that occur are: 1. The normal breathing patterns change. The person holds his breath during the initial phase of the shock, and when breathing resumes, it is generally ragged and uneven. 2. Adrenaline. Adrenaline is released into the system by the adrenal glands. 3. The heart rate quickens and the blood pressure elevates. 4. The person's eyes may appear vacant and distant. 5. The face may lose color and may appear grayish. 6. The skin may feel cold to touch. On the emotional level, the person shuts down or becomes numb. In the above case history, the child became numb because he was unable to deal with the overwhelming fear that one of his parents had been killed. We must keep in mind the child's point of view. Children cannot live without adults to take care of them. Young children do not have the skills to survive in the world without adults, and generally speaking, the only adults whom they know and trust are their parents. The death or the imagined death of a parent threatens both the emotional and physical existence of a child. Children know that they cannot survive by themselves. Going numb was a protective measure on the part of the child. He was protecting himself from the overwhelming fear of not only the loss of a parent, but the possibility of his not surviving the shooting. He went into shock. Shock and recovery generally conform to the following model. First, there is the reaction to the catastrophe, shock. This is when the initial psychological, physical effects of the trauma occur. Second is the rebound stage, when the feelings of the person experiencing the trauma or catastrophe begin to be felt. Third is the resolution stage, when the person resolves the feelings of fear, anger, loss, etc., that they were experiencing as a result of the initial trauma. What happened to this boy during and immediately after the shooting incident was that at the same time of the shooting, he went into shock. His emotions shut down. A part of him that expressed his feelings was repressed, and he went numb. While the shutting down of emotions is normal in the shock state, this boy never fully recovered. He never had a chance to process his feelings, and part of him stayed numb. A piece of his emotional life was repressed. All through the boy's life, through his teen years and into adulthood, a part of the boy would remain in shock. This is chronic shock. Restated, chronic shock is the experiencing of a catastrophic event and not resolving the physical, psychological effects of that catastrophe. Many ACAs, because of the inherent nature of the alcoholic family, suffer from chronic shock. The situation described above is a true case history. What must be remembered is that the incident described was but one in a series of incidents. That is true for many children who come from alcoholic families. Growing up in an alcoholic family can be a series of trauma, shock, and repressions. Trauma and stress are a part of the human condition. All of us learn how to deal with events in our lives that are traumatic and painful. The success with which we deal with these events to a large extent determines how full our emotional lives will be. The child who was raised in an alcoholic family learns to deal with the traumas of life in a way that helps him survive, but this does not release this child from the emotional effects of the trauma. The alcoholic family operates in a mode that is dysfunctional. The 4 family rules of rigidity, silence, denial, and isolation ensure that if there is a traumatic event, the event will not be resolved in a healthy way. The alcoholic family cannot resolve these issues in a healthy way. It does not know how. The only thing the family knows how to do is become more rigid, more silent, deny that anything is out of the ordinary, and more isolated. The alcoholic family is a chaotic and often violent system. Therefore, there is the likelihood of more trauma in an alcoholic family than in other healthier families. The drug, when consumed, often leads to violent behavior and increases the likelihood of serious accidents. Therefore, there is an increased possibility that ACAs will suffer from chronic shock. In fact, my conservative estimate would be that over 50% of those raised in alcoholic families are to some degree in chronic shock. In the healthy family system, the child has an opportunity to process his or her feelings and get emotional resolution to whatever caused the trauma. This resolution may take time and work on the part of the parents and the child, but it does happen. The loving support and safety that a child needs to resolve traumatic issues does not exist in the alcoholic family. The alcoholic family is not a safe place for a child. The chronic shock flow chart on page 54 graphically points out the difference between how a child from an alcoholic family and a child from a healthy family deal with a shock event. Let's look a little more closely, reading from the top down. The child. The human organism seeks to remain in homeostasis, or balance. This balance ensures that there is a consistent and stable environment for the organism, which in this case is the child. Even when the child is living in an alcoholic family, no matter how dysfunctional the the child has found some kind of internal balance and has arranged some kind of stability to aid his survival. Shock event. This is the catastrophic event that has severely upset the child's balance. The event could be the death of a parent, or, as in the previous case history, the imagined death of a parent. The event could also be any type of sexual abuse, a physical trauma such as surgery, or an accident. Divorce, the breakup of the family, and child abuse, both verbal and physical, can also be shock events. The list is not limited to the above. Shock stage. During this stage, the physical and emotional effects of the trauma are felt. The human organism is on overload. The body gears up for the disaster. Rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, and adrenaline entering the system are some of the physical events that occur. Emotional shutdown occurs. The person experiences being numb. If asked how he felt, the person would most likely answer that he was okay and did not feel anything. There may also be a vacant or distant look in his or her eyes. Rebound stage. It is in this stage that the person, in this case a child, begins to seek to restore himself to the pre-shock state. At this time, the physical body begins to rebalance itself, and the emotions that have been shut down begin to be felt. The person has a desire and need to talk about the shock event. Resolution stage. In this stage, the person experiencing the trauma resolves the feelings which he or she had about the catastrophe. The fear, anger, terror, hurt, rage, hopelessness, and helplessness that are experienced are talked about and resolved. Equilibrium is restored to the person. Not only is the shock resolved, but during resolution, the person learns and grows from the catastrophic event. Until the resolution stage, there is little difference between how the child of an alcoholic family reacts and how the child from a healthy family reacts. Let's look more closely at the differences between what takes place in the alcoholic family and what takes place in a healthy, functional family. Functional family. It is explained that trauma is a part of life and that it can happen to anyone. The child gains a realistic view of the event and understands that he or she is not the cause of the catastrophe. The family provides emotional support and safety. The child is then able to express the overwhelming feelings that occurred during the shock state. The child is able to discharge the emotions that he has stored up in his body. The openness and the ability to talk, not just to family members, but also to those outside the family, such as counselors, school personnel, and friends, is extremely important. This allows the child to integrate the incident into his life. When this integration is complete, the shock is healed and resolution is achieved. The child is whole and healthy. Alcoholic family. There is a marked difference in how the child living in an alcoholic family deals with trauma. In the alcoholic family, silence engulfs the members. No one talks about the incident. The child is left to interpret what the trauma means. This interpretation often takes the form of the child blaming himself for the occurrence of the traumatic event. He is unable to talk about his emotions to anyone in the family. This silence also extends outside of the family. One of the rules of the alcoholic family is the rule of silence, and during a catastrophic event, this rule is in full force. The child has no one to turn to, no one who is safe enough for him to express those feelings that are bottled up inside. The members may appear to pull together and support one another, but this is an illusion. In reality, the alcoholic family is disorganized and provides very little support. As a result of being unable to talk and express the feelings that are inside of him, and without the support of the family, the child shuts down emotionally. A part of the child becomes numb and stays that way. The overwhelming fear that the child has as a result of the trauma must be dealt with, and he will deal with it any way he can. At this point, memory loss often occurs, and the child loses the ability to recall the event. The child may also dissociate from the event, and although he may be able to recall the trauma, when it is remembered, it is as if it happened to another person. The child will often relate that the memory of the trauma has a movie-like quality. This dissociation and memory loss will extend into adulthood and, until treated, will remain with the person. When the shock is not resolved, the chronic shock state occurs. Case history. At 26, Lisa R. joined an ACA group. She presented many of the same problems that ACAs seem to have in abundance. She felt that she was not normal. She feared and wanted intimacy, and she felt she did not have the skills to make it in the world. She was fearful that she would never have a full emotional life. Anytime she was faced with a stressful, good or bad, situation, she went numb. Lisa knew that going numb was not normal, but this was a pattern she had adopted all of her life. During group therapy, it was revealed that Lisa had been sexually molested when she was 5 years old by a non-family member, a stranger. When Lisa spoke of the molestation, she was unemotional, as if it had happened to someone else. She could remember that the event had taken place, but could not remember any of the details. In her words, "It is as if 4 or 5 hours have been ripped out of my life." Although Lisa's parents found out about the molestation, nothing therapeutic was done for their daughter. She was told to forget about what had happened and not to talk about it. Because of the already established no-talk rules in Lisa's alcoholic family, she was not able to resolve any of the feelings that she had about being molested. The ring of silence that bound Lisa's family also extended outside the bounds of the immediate family. Consequently, Lisa could not get outside support from anyone. Using the chronic shock flowchart on page 54, it is easy to see why Lisa went into chronic shock. As you study Lisa's chart below, compare the differences between her real family situation and the hypothetical healthy family situation. It is important for ACAs to understand these effects because so many ACAs are in chronic shock. When an ACA feels stuck or unable to move in recovery, very often it is the chronic shock issue that is hampering the recovery process. The problem is that unless the ACA or his or her therapist knows about chronic shock, they will miss the issue altogether. Counselors of ACAs will have so many clients in chronic shock that if the therapists don't have some understanding of it, they will be able to assist their clients only so far in the recovery process. Until chronic shock issues are resolved, there will be only limited recovery, which, of course, is better than no recovery at all. ACAs may choose not to work on chronic shock issues. If this is the case, it does not mean that the ACA will not make progress. Many people choose not to resolve chronic shock issues. They experience limited recovery and are at peace with that. Ricky, an ACA, who was in a therapy group of mine, is a good example of a person who chose not to work on chronic shock issue. She had been in therapy for approximately 1 year and had done excellent work on becoming more assertive in her relationships with men. This was the primary reason that she entered therapy. In the course of therapy, it came to light that she had an older brother who had been killed in an automobile accident when she was 5 years old. She had only vague memories of him, but had a feeling that she and he were very close. She also had very sketchy memories of that period of her time. When I asked her about how her family dealt with her brother's death, her reply was, "That was a subject that no one ever talked about. I think I remember that my mother cleaned out his room and packed his stuff away, but I'm not sure. We just never brought his name up in family conversation again. He was gone and no one talked about it." When Ricky talked about her brother, her voice filled with emotion and she got teary-eyed. I talked to her about chronic shock and told her that if she decided to work on this issue, she would most likely experience the grief and loss that she was unable to process when she was a child. I also told her that On the positive side, the releasing of the blocked emotions of grief and loss might positively change the difficulty she had in allowing herself to become more open and vulnerable in intimate relationships with men. Ricky chose not to work on the issue. She did not wish to open up a Pandora's box. She was content with the work that she had done and thought that maybe someday in the future she would be willing to work on the death of her brother. I supported her decision. No one should ever be forcefully encouraged to work on issues that he or she does not want to work on. Symptoms of chronic shock. Below are some of the symptoms that ACAs can look for to determine if they are in chronic shock. Self-diagnosing chronic shock can be very helpful to the ACA's recovery process. However, as with most self-diagnosis, it is often desirable to check your conclusions with a qualified professional counselor. It is important that ACAs have information about chronic shock so that they can determine whether they wish to proceed with treatment. This section was also written with the therapist in mind and was designed to assist the therapist in identifying clients who are in chronic shock. Number 1, a narrow range of emotional experience. This generally manifests in 2 distinct types. The first is the person who feels he or she has been shortchanged in the emotions department. This person feels that his or her emotions are not deep and has the sense that he or she is not experiencing a full range of emotions. Sometimes he or she will state that he doesn't feel anything deeply. These individuals do very often, however, experience emotional outbursts like fits of rage and deep unexplained grief. The second type is the person who may appear to have deep emotions, and he or she does, but the range of the emotional experience is narrow. These individuals swing between anger, sadness, terror, and fear, but they don't experience the broad range of emotions that is possible in the human experience. Number 2, the feeling of going numb when faced with talking about a painful experience. ACAs have learned how to survive, and one of the most effective survival techniques is going numb or shutting down emotionally. When faced with the overwhelming emotional pain of trauma, ACAs unconsciously block emotions and do not feel. When, during therapy, they are faced with talking about the painful periods in their lives, where one or more catastrophic traumas happened, ACAs will go numb. This is unconscious and is their way of protecting themselves. This learned way of dealing with painful events is something at which ACAs are masters, and they use it on almost any occasion when they feel they are being pressed or overwhelmed. Unfortunately, ACAs often go numb during happy or overwhelming events such as weddings. Number 3, poor or no memory recall of the time surrounding a traumatic event. Another way that ACAs deal with overwhelming trauma is to repress the memory of the event. Many times they will have a sense that something important has happened to them, but they cannot remember what it was. Generally speaking, the more violent or repressive the alcoholic family was, the greater the memory loss. Holidays can be very stressful and violent in the alcoholic family. Many times the existence of trauma can be discovered when ACAs try to remember their holiday experiences. Number 4, shortened attention span. This is another way to avoid re-experiencing the trauma when asked about a particular traumatic event. ACAs in chronic shock will often refocus on another topic. During therapy, they will unconsciously do this over and over. The closer they get to the event, the more they will attempt to change the topic. Number 5, confused thinking. Another way to mask trauma is by confused thinking, which is caused by the overwhelming fear that is felt as a result of the trauma. When ACAs begin to re-experience the emotional impact of the catastrophic event, their thought patterns can become very disjointed and disorganized. This confusion allows ACAs to avoid dealing with the emotional effects of the event. Confused thinking keeps ACAs in their heads and away from their feelings. Number 6, a feeling of hopelessness. When faced with an overwhelming catastrophe, a feeling that this will never end and there is no hope that things will get better, is manifested. When the shock of the event is not resolved, the feeling of hopelessness remains with the person. It is common to hear ACAs speak of their hopelessness. Number 7, a feeling of helplessness. Because of the nature of the catastrophic events that cause chronic shock, it is natural for the person involved to feel helpless, both during and immediately after the event has taken place. For those suffering from chronic shock, the feeling of helplessness remains with them. It manifests in all areas of their lives, including relationships and work situations. A common statement or attitude the ACAs in chronic shock share is, "There's nothing that I or anyone else can do to help me feel better or more whole." Number 8. Many times the ACA who is in chronic shock will identify joy or happiness as the absence of painful emotions rather than as a feeling itself. Number 9. Intense feelings at inappropriate times. These are feelings directly linked to the shock event that have gone unresolved and will continue to surface until the shock is resolved. ACAs in chronic shock have these feelings bottled up inside of them and cannot control when they will resurface. Some of the most common feelings are intense grief, anger, and sadness. These feelings seem to come up for no apparent reason and may be triggered by movies, TV shows, etc. ACAs do not know where these feelings come from, and they are mystified as to why they have them. Number 10. Denying that a traumatic event has had any effect. ACAs often make statements like, "I remember Dad tearing the phone off the wall and hitting Mom with it, but I don't think that has had any effect on me." Or, "It was no big deal." The truth is that the event did make a big impact on them, but they are not capable of recognizing that because they have repressed the emotional impact of the occurrence. Number 11. Observation during therapy. During therapy sessions, ACAs will often display the physical characteristics of a person in shock. This happens most often when the counselor begins to explore the time in the client's life when the catastrophic event occurred. When I worked as a counselor in the emergency room of a city hospital, I received much firsthand experience in working with people who had experienced extreme shock. During therapy sessions in private practice, I noticed that people who experienced a trauma in their past that was unresolved and even unremembered often re-experienced the physical as well as the emotional characteristics of shock victims, i.e., rapid heartbeat, ragged breath patterns, look of horror, feeling cold, etc. The counselor who chooses to work with ACAs must have not only a firm basis in general counseling skills and principles, but must also have a wide range of knowledge in dealing with specific issues such as incest, sexual abuse of all kinds, child abuse, both physical and emotional, unresolved grief, and catastrophic trauma. All of the above can individually or collectively cause chronic shock. Due to the very nature of the alcoholic family with its high stress and tendency toward violence and abuse of all kinds, the ACA's population is at much higher risk than the general population to be in chronic shock. When I facilitate ACA's groups, each having no more than 7 people, I can count on having at least one person who was sexually abused as a child, one who had a parent die, one who suffered physical abuse, and one or more whose parents divorced in a traumatic way. I can also count on these people being in chronic shock because they have not been able to reach resolution on any of these issues. Treating chronic shock. Since the treatment for chronic shock almost always involves a professional counselor, I have written this section to assist the therapist in designing treatment strategies for clients who are in chronic shock. Therefore, much of the text is worded with the counselor-client relationship in mind. Those ACAs who read this, and who are not counselors, are encouraged to use this information to assess for themselves if they are in chronic shock, and then, if appropriate, to seek professional treatment. When treating ACAs who are in chronic shock, it is important to be aware that there is a general order or flow to the treatment. Once we are aware that the chronic shock state exists, the ACA can be guided through the stages of treatment. These stages are diagrammed in the treatment flowchart. We will continue to use Lisa's case history as a model. We can do this because even though there is a difference between each client and a difference in the kind of situations that cause chronic shock, the generalized treatment is basically the same in all cases. Although the cycles of treatment are generally the same, the length of treatment will vary greatly from person to person. Let's look more closely at the treatment flowchart. Number 1. Chronic shock state. This is the cycle of unexplained feelings, emotional shutdowns, and unexplainable behaviors that are linked to the shock event. See previous definition for more detail. In Lisa's case, these symptoms were being unable to experience her feelings, going numb, unreasonable fear about being alone, sexual dysfunction, and the inability to become intimate with men. Number 2. Need to resolve. As Lisa grew older and became more mature, she began to have an increasing awareness that something was wrong with her. She did not know what was happening, but she did know that she was not happy. When she entered therapy, she said it was to do something, but she did not know what. She had to think her way into happiness and act her way into happiness, but it always eluded her. She was tired of trying and wanted to resolve what was going on with her so she could be happy. Number 3. Therapeutic environment. In order to work through chronic shock issues, the client must have a safe environment. This is a must. The key element in providing a safe environment is trust. The client must develop a trusting relationship with the counselor, and if working in a group setting, trusting relationships with the other group members. Building trust takes time. It does not happen overnight. It is a process. Take time. Don't rush into deep emotional work prematurely. Before ACAs can experience repressed emotions in front of others, they must take the essential step of trusting that, unlike their alcoholic family of origin, the group will not reject them from expressing their fear, anger, hurt, rage, and shame. It is more than a coincidence that the safe therapeutic environment is similar to the environment of the healthy family. See chronic shock flowchart on page 54. The person working through chronic shock issues will be experiencing some powerful and frightening emotions that have been repressed for a long time. The reason for chronic shock was that there was no safe place to work out powerful and frightening emotions. For Lisa, it took several months in group for her to feel comfortable and safe enough to begin to work on the issue of being molested. Number 4. Cycles of re-experience. During this stage of treatment, the client experiences the emotions and sometimes the physical effects of the original trauma. In this phase, the client will typically dip into the experience and then shut down emotionally. Then he or she will dip back down into the experience and shut down again emotionally. This will occur again and again and is to be expected. ACAs are masters at shutting down, and this is how they will attempt to deal with the feelings that they are experiencing. Normally, it will take more than 1 or 2 sessions to work through a chronic shock issue. It is a process that may take months to complete, particularly when working in a group setting. Lisa's recovery from chronic shock took months and required a number of individual sessions in addition to group work. Number 5. Emotional discharge. The client in chronic shock has intense and deep emotions that have been repressed for a long time, sometimes decades and longer. As these emotions are experienced and recognized for what they are, the energy behind these emotions is discharged. It is the discharging of this energy that releases the client from the effects of chronic shock. When discharge takes place, healing can occur. Emotional discharge often takes place through catharsis. Sobbing, screaming in anger and rage, and screaming in fear are some of the ways this happens. Not all emotional discharge is cathartic. Many times discharge will take place quietly, with a quiet shudder or a tightening or relaxing of the body, accompanied by a sigh. Talking about the feelings that are being experienced is an important part of the process of discharging. As Lisa worked through her chronic shock, she demonstrated all of the above types of discharge and release. This is true for most people who work through chronic shock issues. Number 6, sense of release. As the process of releasing and letting go of the pent-up feelings continues, many clients report that they feel lighter and looser. They often say that they feel free. This feeling of freedom is often accompanied by a heightened sense of self-awareness, an increase in the general level of health, and a more positive outlook on life. As Lisa continued her work, her facial features became softer and less rigid. She reported that she felt less stuck and made some major changes in her relationships, both at work and in her personal life. Number 7, resolution, integration. In this, the final phase, the shock event that was repressed has lost its power over the client and has been integrated into the client's life. It has become a part of his or her life experience, to be neither dwelt upon nor ignored. It often occurs during this phase that the catastrophic event that caused so much pain becomes a vehicle by which the client grows both emotionally and spiritually. At the time of this writing, Lisa was becoming increasingly more aware of how her experience could become an asset and a powerful vehicle for her spiritual growth. Some general guidelines that we can use when working with clients who are experiencing chronic shock are: A. Be aware that the condition exists. Take in-depth client histories. Being alert for the events that can cause chronic shock. This is very important. Taking a good, solid history can shorten the client's time in therapy by helping the therapist focus on the important issues. B. Inform the client of what you know about chronic shock and how you will be working with it. It is important that the client know why he is feeling and behaving in a way that makes no logical sense and why there are chunks of memories missing from his or her life. It affirms that they are not crazy or odd. Their life begins to make sense. An educated client is the most powerful ally a therapist can have. C. Assist the client in filling in the memory gaps and remembering the details of the event. Encourage them to go and talk to family members and others who can be of assistance in filling in the lost parts of his or her personal history. During therapy, encourage the client to recall the blocked memories. Remember to be patient and take as much time as needed. Working to assist clients in getting their memories back is like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. It takes time to fit pieces together, and then all of a sudden the pattern becomes clear, and suddenly the puzzle is complete and recognizable. D. Challenge the denial. Most clients will try, unconsciously, to deny that the event ever happened, or that if it did happen, then it did not have very much impact on them. Challenging is the gentle art of reminding the client that whatever it was that happened to them has had a tremendous impact on their lives, both at the time the event took place and in the present. Very rarely is it necessary or desirable to use hard confrontation with clients in chronic shock. E. Support and encourage the client through the feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. When the client is at the bottom of the pit of hopelessness and helplessness, it seems that things will never get better. They adopt the mindset of, what is the use of all this? It is very important to affirm the client that the feelings that he or she are having are part of the process of letting go of the trauma, that it is important to re-experience the repressed and blocked feelings in order to let them go. F. Do not push the client into moving too fast. Dealing with these issues takes time. Pushing can cause both physical and emotional damage to the client. Many of the traumas of ACAs involve physical abuse, either sexual or beatings or both. Remember that the original event was so overwhelming to the client that he or she repressed the emotional impact of it. Remembering the event can and will be very painful. Pushing the client too fast can result in actual physical illness and emotional overload. A good rule of thumb is, when in doubt, move slower. G. If the client is a recovering alcoholic, he or she must have a firm basis in sobriety before working on these issues, which are highly charged emotionally and can cause much discomfort when they are being released. The newly sober alcoholic or other chemically dependent person generally needs some time to gain the emotional stability that is important to have in order to work on chronic shock issues. H. Working in a group testing with ACAs is a very effective method of dealing with these issues. The group not only gives much-needed support to the client, but also allows the individual to be intermittent rather than continuous. This spreads the work out over a period of time and is potentially less debilitating to the client. I. Chronic shock can happen at any age. Although the focus here has been on childhood, it is important to realize that chronic shock can occur whenever trauma is not resolved. Working through chronic shock issues is both painful and frightening. There is no way around this. ACAs who are in chronic shock must be informed that the process of recovery will hurt, but that at the end of the tunnel of pain and fear there is freedom and joy that must be experienced and understood. This is an act of faith on the part of the adult child, faith and trust in us as counselors, and in a broader sense, faith in the process of the universe. Dealing with the trauma of life is fundamentally a spiritual issue. The questions raised by adult children about why this happened to them will challenge not only the ACA's beliefs and philosophies, but also those of the counselor.